At the time of recording this video, I've been playing on the Albion East beta server for around 1 week, focusing on figuring out how to get the best possible start when the real server releases later. In this video, I'll share what I've learned about the best possible things you can do to make a lot of money and progress your account early. Now, just a real quick note before we begin, this is not a beginner's guide. It is rather intended for players who have played the game on Albion West and are going to try out Albion East. So before we head into the video and look at how you make a bunch of money early, one thing that you have to know going into this server is that crafting and getting items early on is going to be extremely challenging compared to how it is on Albion West. You will not be able to craft or refine tier 4 gear unless you make your own stations. More than likely, at least. It could change in the real server, especially with people getting like a 5-day head start, but in the beta, there was basically no public stations available that were tier 4 for both crafting or refining in like the first 3+ days. The plots in the towns start at 2.5 million silver, at least they did in the beta. In the real server, again, they'll be expensive, so people aren't going to want to shell out that much money just to put a station down that's going to be constantly used by people for low tier stuff. So any organized group is going to make them on their guild islands where they're not public, and even if someone does buy a station in a town, the silver rates to use it are going to be absurdly high, and everybody's going to be using it, so the durability is basically going to be at 0 the entire time. If you're planning on doing any crafting or refining, or you're planning on getting an early set of tier 4 gear, you absolutely have to make your own stations somehow. Obviously, the best way to do this is to join a group early on, make a guild, and collaborate together to put all the stations on the guild island and get them leveled up to tier 4. But if you don't have a guild and you're a solo player, you're going to want to factor in building an island early on, getting it up to around level 3+ to start making some specific stations so you can at least get yourself a tier 4 weapon. Eventually, tier 4 gear will start getting put on the market as well, but again, the first tier 4 gear that gets on the market is going to be super expensive, so if you are planning on rushing for a good start, chances are you're going to want to make your own stations somehow. Of course, this means that if you are going in as a solo player and not planning to buy premium, or you don't have premium at the start some way, meaning you can't get an island, it's going to be pretty rough. I would highly suggest if you're a solo player and you don't have the means to purchase premium right away to get an island, that at least join a group for the first week or so just to have access to stations, or else you're really going to struggle to get tier 4 gear. So the best way to start on a new server is just to make as much money as you possibly can. And depending on how you like to play the game, there are 3 general categories that can all make you a ton of money early on in the server: PvPing, PvEing, and doing more of the economy, crafting, gathering, or finding sorts of parts. So let's look at the best ways to make money early on with each of these activities. Starting with PvP, because this one is very simple. Basically, you just get a group of as many people as you can together and you run around and kill people. Honestly, I didn't really do any of this in the beta. It's going to be pretty hit or miss, but if you're planning on doing this, the one thing you have to look out for is the mount situation. So in the FAQ for the East server, SBI stated that there would be some beginner mounts and food and stuff available on the cross marketplaces. This was not in place for the beta, so I don't know if they've decided to remove this or if it's only going to be for the real server start. But if they're easily attainable, like tier 4 oxes and riding horses, PvP is going to be a lot harder than it was in the beta. In the beta, every single player was on a donkey for the first like 3 days, and so it was super easy to dismount people. If this is the case, getting together with a group of friends with some catch weapons and just ganking everybody you see in the black and red zones can be a very good money making strategy early, but if strong mounts start on the markets and they're fairly cheap, it could be a little bit rough, and you might consider doing some PvE or more economy based money making strategies. For PvEing, killing mobs to make money, the absolute best strategy, probably of everything to do early on in this server, is going to be going deep into the black zone and just killing all the open world mobs. Killing open world mobs early on in the server like this is going to give you absolutely everything that you need. They give a ton of fame, so you'll spec up super fast and progress your account, and more importantly, they give you a lot of money. Compared to things like dungeons, most of the loot in open world mobs comes from the raw silver drops and not random item drops that come along with them. Because of the way that item drops work in Albion, if there's not many people crafting and selling to the black market, which there isn't going to be early on, especially for high tier stuff, the value of things like chests, which are mainly influenced by the items you get in them, is going to be a lot less than they normally would be. So open world mobs, which mainly get the money from the raw silver drops, are absolutely amazing because they're not really affected too much by the lack of black market activity. In the beta, there was people that had like 10 million silver worth of drops on the first 24 hours just by going onto the black zone and constantly killing open world mobs. Now that was boosted rates in terms of silver, but still the fact that you can go out with a set of tier 3 gear into the black zone and make millions of silver in your first day is pretty insane. One thing to just quickly add here, if you're planning on doing this, I would highly suggest using a very PvE specific weapon like the Nature Staff, even if you aren't planning to use that later on, just because getting the efficiency early on with the tier 3 gear is really important. Last but not least, looking at how to make money early on using the more economy side of the game with crafting, refining, and gathering, there are two really good ways of making money. First is, especially if you're with a group rushing tier 4 items onto the market, you can sell tier 4 items for absurdly expensive if they're some of the first ones on the market. This is really going to depend on how tryhard your group is, how early you get in, what the other players who've gotten an early start have been doing, so it's not the most consistent and you have to sort of look at the market and see what's up, but it could get you a lot of money. The better way to go, in my opinion, is to do some black market transporting. So really basically the way that the black market works is that the more players are doing some activity that generates loot, the more expensive that loot gets in the black market, or the higher the price the black market will buy it for. So what happened in the beta and what I expect to happen in the real server is that since you have basically the entire server at the start trying to get their account off the ground, level it up from ground zero, every single player is basically killing these super low tier mobs, doing low tier dungeons, and all the low tier stuff, which means in the black market, all of the low tier gear shoots up extremely fast, getting extremely expensive. Check out these prices from the first couple days of the beta server. You have tier 2 items going for 10k silver. That takes like 2 minutes to craft at most, and it's going for 10k silver on the black market. Tier 3 items over 50k. If you just craft a whole bunch of tier 2 items and transport them to Caerleon and stash them there over the first week or so, those tier 2 items are going to sell for some insane profits. Now, obviously, if every single player on the server watches this video and is like, wow, that seems really good, and they're going to do it, then it's not going to be as good. But I really doubt that, especially with the raw amount of activity that's going to be happening in the low tier zones. These items are going to shoot up really fast, and they should constantly be selling for at least like big profit margins. Okay, so after you've progressed a little bit, you've made a lot of starting money using crafting or open world mobs or whatever it is, the way you really start to take over in a server and make a ton of money is transitioning into a specialist. The best money is going to be made by specializing in one specific activity or one specific crafting tree or something like that. Reward in Albion is based on risk versus reward and competition. So for example, the best loot in the game, the highest rewards you can get are focused around those late game, full loot PvP activities that are not safe. The ones that force PvP or force you to transport through dangerous zones or something like that. However, if you rush to some late game activity and get there before everybody else, it completely throws off that balance of risk versus reward and competition. You can get all of the reward from that activity with zero of the risk. Take, for example, the first person that reaches the IP requirements and infamy level to go into Slayer Corrupted dungeons. The very first person, if they immediately go into a Slayer Corrupted dungeon, there is a literal 0% chance for them to get invaded or find another player to fight because nobody else in the server has reached the requirement set. That means that they get to freely farm that incredibly lucrative activity until somebody else reaches the requirements and starts contesting them for them. Same thing for, say, 10v10 Hellgates. Hellgates. If you can get a 10v10 lethal Hellgate team going as soon as you possibly can, and there's no one else doing 10v10 lethal Hellgates, that incredibly lucrative activity for fame and money is going to be all yours with no danger and no contention. Same thing for things like crafting and gathering. The first person to hit tier 8 crafting on the beta server made an absolute dumb amount of money just making tier 8 items and selling them to the black market because they'd slowly been going up and there's absolutely nobody to sell to the black market, so they made hundreds of millions of silver. What I did in the beta is I rushed a really strong solo build with a nature staff mercenary jacket, and I went out into the roads and killed the aspects of fiber and wood aspects to get a ton of really good gathering early on. When I was out there, literally every single aspect in every single node of the roads was up. I had zero contest for those aspects. If I went to a gathering node area, there was an aspect there for me to kill. So if you really want to get a lot of money early on, start thinking about what you want your specialist activity to be and try to rush it as fast as possible. Some things, like being the first person to have tier 8 crafting of a certain item, is almost certainly going to be gotten by a member of a guild that's being fed, but there are other things that you can do as a solo. Really, my suggestion would just be to pick your favorite activity from Albion West that you like doing and think about how you can specialize in it in some way to get to be the first person or one of the first people to really abuse that activity. Now, one of the most important things as you're making a lot of money early on in the server is to never hold onto your silver. You basically want to always be investing your silver as much as possible. As the server goes on, especially as tons of people are going to be focusing on things like fame farming, the amount of silver in the game or in the server is going to grow steadily and quickly. So if you're holding onto silver, it's going to devalue pretty fast. So ideally, you want to find some items that aren't going to devalue over time, or even ideally, they're going to increase in value over time for you to spend your silver on as you're making it. One of the more obvious ways you can do this that wasn't really available to try out in the beta is the gold market. The gold market was not active during the beta, but in the real server, it will be active, and it's a really good chance that gold is going to start out super cheap and it's going to slowly get more and more expensive. Specific items that are used too can change drastically in their price over time early on in the server. One thing in the beta that was really big for investing was like runes, souls, and relics. You can see the prices of these over time. Depending on the tier, they sort of spike when people are sort of just getting to that tier. So like, for example, tier 8 runes, souls, and relics early at the first day of the server are not very valuable because nobody has a use for them. Nobody has tier 8 gear, nobody's trying to craft tier 8 artifacts. They're basically worthless, so they're super cheap. But fast forward like a couple days or a week, when people are just starting to get to that tier 8 crafting, those tier 8 artifacts of runes, souls, relics, and artifacts for crafting are going to get really expensive. I mean, these like tripled in price, some of them. Skins too, you know how skins can get absurdly expensive, especially the exclusive ones like the founder skins from Albion West are absurdly expensive now. The East ones are surely to go up over time as well, so you can purchase somebody's skins early on. Those are going to be a very long-term investment, though you're not going to be able to get your money back on those very quickly or easy. Basically, you just kind of want to find somewhere to invest your silver so that it's not just sitting around devaluing over time. Okay, for our last section here, there was just some interesting things I noticed in the beta or thought about that don't fit particularly well with the rest of the video, so here are some interesting things you can think about or maybe look to do. So first off, really quick, there's been some discussion about doing the tutorial versus not doing the tutorial. I would highly suggest doing the tutorial unless you have a very specific plan about how you're going to get set up with absolutely no items to start with. You can quickly do the tutorial in only 15 minutes, so it really doesn't take too long and it gets you set up pretty well. I would highly suggest doing it. Next, the most obvious strategy early on for making a lot of money is doing something around stone gathering and refining. Everybody's going to be building up stations early on and everybody's going to have a demand for stone. So in theory, it should be a really good thing to do, but I'm a little bit skeptical just because it's so obvious. It will definitely make you money 100%, but I'm not sure how much money it is going to make you because again, like it is, when you just think about the supply and demand early on, you know that stone is going to be in high demand, so it's a really obvious thing to do. So I'm a little bit worried that there's going to be a ton of people trying to make stone early on. So if your plan is to produce stone and stone blocks early on, I might suggest having a backup plan just in case everybody's like, this is the thing to do, and the market gets really saturated really fast. Now, if you've made it this far in the video, I have a little secret thing that I was going to do, a secret strategy. I was going to do it, but decided not to do it. You can use this if you want to. If you early on go into the mists as fast as possible and farm that 50k Brazilian rep as fast as you possibly can, the Brazilian red zone should be pretty dead. Basically, nobody ever remembers that that thing exists in the first place, and they're certainly not going to be thinking about it on the start of a new server, so those 4 zones around Brazilian could be really dead early on, making them an amazing place that's not completely sucked dry of all value like a lot of the other zones might be. For example, all the resources should be basically full, and all the mobs should be pretty leveled up, allowing you to get a lot of fame and money. Now, it is a little bit risky because if you spend a lot of time getting that 50k rep early on and then it turns out a lot of people have the same strategy, well, it's kind of a waste of time. Last but not least, one more secret strategy for you is doing faction transports early on. Faction hearts are used to create capes, and so there should be a pretty good demand for them early on. Not in the first couple days, but after the server's out for a little bit and people are starting to craft those tier 4 capes, the demand for them should be pretty high. If you go out and do faction transports early, the chance of getting ganked is probably going to be extremely small. More if you go through the red zone, but especially in the blue and yellow zones, I cannot imagine people really early on in the server rushing to go do safe zone ganking for faction, because I mean, that's just not a reliable activity at all. It should be 100% safe, and you should be able to get some pretty good profits by doing it. Okay, and there you have it. Those are my tips and advice for getting the best possible start on Albion East. I hope this video helped you out or you enjoyed it. If you did, do all the things you do to YouTube videos, and I'll see you in the next one.